How do the lessons the United States has learned in Iraq apply to the rest of the Middle East and North Africa? We'll look at the options next.
This program was made possible by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office.
Hello and welcome to the Global Perspectives Show. I'm John Bersia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at the University of Central Florida. Our guest today is Ambassador J. Paul Bremer, former Coalition Provisional Authority head in Iraq. Welcome, Ambassador Bremer.
Nice to be with you.
Thanks for joining us today. So tell us, from your perspective today, what was the experience like in Iraq when you first arrived, and then we can see what has developed in the subsequent years.
Well, when I arrived in Iraq, the situation was pretty grim. Baghdad was on fire because the looting had been taking place for about 2.5 weeks since Saddam really had left Baghdad. The country was completely closed down. All the schools and hospitals were closed. The banking system was closed. The government hadn't been paid for 3 months. We were producing no oil and almost no electricity. Other than that, it was great.
And so what was your first task that you decided needed immediate attention?
Basically, the Coalition Provisional Authority, which was the civilian part of the occupation that I headed, had 2 jobs. We had to get the economy going, and we had to start Iraq on a path to representative government. Those were our 2 strategic goals that we pursued for the entire 14 months I was there.
And where did you personally feel you were seeing progress in those 2 areas, at least initially, compared to the massive task you just described?
Yeah, I think the important immediate thing was to get the economy turning over. So we set a plan to immediately start paying the civil servants, the teachers, everybody who hadn't been paid for 3 months. No pensions had been paid, no salaries. We removed all the external tariffs to encourage the import of white goods, television sets, discs for cable TV, which had been outlawed under Saddam Hussein, try to get the internet going, cell phone systems going. We got hospitals back and running by giving them generators. We rebuilt a couple of thousand schools. I mean, basically we had to get some action going in the economy right away, which we did in the first 60 days or so. We got quite a lot going. The economy started moving right away.
And then since those early days, we've had some ups and downs in Iraq, but from your vantage point today, do you feel we are more or less on track where we need to be in terms of the future stability and security of the country?
Well, I think first on the economy, I think it's clear Iraq is a rich country, always was. It just was mistreated under Saddam. The Iraqis are producing oil at the pre-war levels now. They've got a government budget that is 4 times as high as it was the year I was there. So they're getting the revenues they need to modernize their economy. They still have a long way to go. On the political side, I think the success has been more evident because one of the things we did, I would argue probably the most important thing we did during the time we were there, was to help the Iraqis create a political framework for their government. And that meant writing a new constitution. And the Iraqis were able to write and then subsequently approve in a referendum one of the most progressive constitutions in the region. And as we look at the situation in the Middle East today, it's a useful lesson on the difficulties but the importance of getting the political scaffolding put in place as you move from dictatorship to democracy. It's not an easy thing, but you've got to get a lot of little things we take for granted: political parties, laws, regulations on the media, how do you get electoral constituencies defined and so forth. These are the things that have to happen, and that's been done in Iraq. They've had 5 elections since we left.
So when you talk about political change, political evolution, for much of the early part of this century, we were focused on Iraq and Afghanistan. Those were the two main examples in that broadly defined region. But in recent months, we've had literally a political explosion of possibilities and changes, dramatic changes in several countries. Are the two tied together in any way? Was there sort of an initial impetus for this that was established because of those experiments in Iraq and Afghanistan?
It's hard to say. I think it is clear that President Bush and his administration took a different approach to the problem American governments have been wrestling with in this region really since the end of the Second World War, which is what is the balance that serves our interests best between stability and democracy. And for a half a century, American administrations of both parties essentially chose stability. In other words, we'll support the Saudis, they pump the oil, and we'll look the other way that it's essentially not a democratic government. And I think Iraq broke that pattern quite intentionally. Bush, basically, his instructions to me were, we're going to help the Iraqis move onto a path of representative government. Now, whether that was in the minds of the people in Cairo who were off at Tahrir Square, I don't know. It may or may not have had some impetus, but it certainly is the case today that we're seeing that a lot of countries in this region, a lot of the Arab countries, the people want to choose their governments.
And what do you think might have brought this to a peak now? Because we've had that desire on the part of many people to change the government, especially in cases where you've had leaders for decades and decades, and you've had poverty issues for years, and you've had inequality and lack of opportunity for young people, all of these things that seem to have played a part in these popular uprisings. But why now?
Well, I suppose historians will have to look back more carefully when this is all over than we can do now. But I suppose there are a couple of things. First of all, this region had the looks of a tinderbox just waiting for a spark. As it happened, the spark was a Tunisian street seller who immolated himself. Who would have ever guessed that that would set off what it has now set off? And in some ways, that's what it needed. It needed a spark, and that's normally, I mean, if you look at our revolution, it was, the shot heard around the world was a spark. It was of a different nature. And I think now, of course, with the communications capability, the speed with which information can be moved outside of government control through social networks and social media, certainly exacerbated the trend and made it happen a lot faster than it probably would have happened in 1775. But the structure of the problem was there before. It just took that spark.
Now, so to look at the issue from the other perspective, do you think these political changes taking place in many countries of North Africa and the Middle East will contribute to the potential success of the new systems in Iraq and Afghanistan? Because the environment is changing, will they have a less difficult time or more difficult time, or will it not have an effect?
First, I think you have to separate Afghanistan and Iraq. I lived in Afghanistan and I've lived in Iraq. They're very different places, so I think one has to not aggregate them. And I think Afghanistan is much further behind in the progress on both political and economic than Iraq. So really the question is Iraq. I don't know. It depends a bit on how the power structure in the region evolves as this process goes forward, and in particular what the role of Iran will become. On the one hand, the situation so far looks favorable to Iran. They've lost one of the main pillars of the Arab power structure, which was a strong Egypt, has been pushed aside, at least temporarily. Now the Iranians can focus on the other one that they care about, which is the Saudis. On the other hand, we now have seen, at least recently in the last few days, unrests in Iran's major regional ally, which is Syria, which is Arab, not Persian, but it's run by a Shia minority. And so I don't know what's going to happen in Syria, or whether any of this push for democratic rule will come back to Iran, where it was, after all, 2 years ago in the Green Revolution. So it's hard to say how this will impact on Iraq until you can make some kind of an assessment as to what happens with Iran, which is, after all, their biggest neighbor.
What about the impact on the other countries of the Persian Gulf area?
Well, we've seen, of course, the concerns that the Saudis have over the potential for Iran to gain a foothold in Bahrain, which potentially gives them then influence in the Shiite-dominated eastern province of Saudi Arabia, which is the major oil-producing place that's really the basis of Saudi wealth. One could argue it's the basis of the Saudi nation, in a way, because it's the wealth that defines the nation in that case of Saudi. And the Saudis clearly were not going to allow, easily anyway, the Bahraini ruling family to be thrown out by an uprising by the Shia majority. I think it is interesting that the Gulf states have supported the Arab League resolution to support the military actions in Libya, and the Qataris have actually apparently started to send some planes in the general direction of Libya. I don't know how far they've gotten or how long it will take them, but at least there is some sense of political cohesion among the Gulf states. It is a bit of a boomerang, because once you support the concept, if you're the Arab League, support the concept that a autocratic or dictatorial leader should be removed from power, which is essentially what's involved here, then the question is, well, why not and then fill in the blank other countries? So it's a bit tricky. It's going to be a very dynamic situation.
Yeah, that's a great question, because where do you draw the lines? Somebody might argue, well, you have decided in the case of Libya that you're doing this for a pretty substantial reason, and are the reasons as compelling elsewhere? Or
well, I think that's one of the problems with the statements so far by the various governments, not just ours. The stated goal is to stop Gaddafi from killing his own citizens. Trouble is, the Syrians killed a bunch of their own citizens over the weekend. They did exactly the same thing, and actually it's in some ways a more brutal suppression. So you can always make the argument, well, if you do Libya, why don't you do Syria? The problem with that is, having some experience in foreign policy, there's no one size fits all. In the end, you really do have to assess each situation on its own. It is clear that Gaddafi, with his background as a terrorist, and by the way, the Syrian government has been on the state-sponsored terrorist list by the U.S. government for just as long as Libya. So it's another state sponsor, like the Iranians. So you could say that's a similarity. We'll see how it develops in a place like Syria. I think that's a key place to look at right now.
Sure, and then you could even add, like you said, Iran to the list. If there's justification in Libya, why not in Iran? There certainly has been repression of the opposition.
Well, of course, in international relations, there can be a difference between justification and wisdom. Just because something is justified doesn't mean you always do it.
If you were in charge of the region, if I could ask you maybe to speculate for a bit, what would you be focusing U.S. efforts on? Would it be staying the course we're on, or would you suggest some other things we might want to consider?
Well, I think my main concern right now is the outcome in Libya. I think it's important when the President of the United States and his Secretary of State say that the result must be that Gaddafi leaves, that we then have to make that if that's our goal, and it is our stated goal, although it's not the stated goal of the military operation, then anything short of that becomes a problem. And it becomes a problem because then people say, well, you Americans talk, but you never follow through. So my main concern right now is that we must succeed in Libya. And by success, I mean Gaddafi's got to go. He's either got to be thrown out, die with his boots on, or some negotiated solution where he goes to Marbella and spends the rest of his life. He's got to leave. It is not acceptable, in my view, to have a situation where Gaddafi continues to control the West, and some usurping government or some government in place is put in Benghazi, and you then have basically a recipe for a very long stalemate and civil war. So I think that right now is, to me, the main concern. And of course, one would be wanting to watch some of the other places like Syria.
But you would say Libya in all of this is unique and is very different from all the other situations, because you don't have one size.
It's hard. I mean, it appears that we're going to have a change in government in Yemen, which could be concerning because Al-Qaeda is very strong in Yemen. They're not a big factor in Libya. And al-Salah has been an ally of ours in the counterterrorism war, which just shows to show sometimes you have to sup with the devil. And I mean, Yemen could also move rather quickly to the top of the list. But you know, I think it's also important to remember we don't have the power to decide all of these things. We can do some things, but in the end, a lot of the dynamics are beyond our ability to predict and to control.
Mm-hmm. So, of the areas we're talking about, where are the ones that you think are most likely going to move in a positive direction? I mean,
I think Egypt will eventually.
Egypt will.
Although I think there are some warning notes out there. The military, I think, rightly wants to hand over soon to a civilian government, but it's rushing the process, in my view, unwisely. It is one of the lessons of Iraq. We held the first elections in Iraq were held too soon. They were held in January of 2005. And the effect of holding elections soon after a change like this, and that was, I mean, that was almost 2 years after Saddam had left. The military in Egypt's talking about having elections in June, you know, several months. That historically always benefits the best organized organizations, and there are three in Egypt. There's the Muslim Brotherhood, there's the Salafi movement, which is basically even more extreme in some ways, and there's Mubarak's old party, the National Democratic Party. It is not surprising to me that the leaders of the Tahrir Square revolution all opposed having this very early referendum on the constitutional amendments that was held over the weekend, and on the argument that it's going to benefit these better organized and more, I would call them reactionary forces. And I think that's a real risk in Egypt. On the other hand, it's a great country with a proud history, and that's important. The Iraqis have that too. These are old cultures. The old Neolithic and Mesopotamian cultures go back millennia, and they have a sense of nation that is extremely helpful. But the Egyptians are going to have I think they have to kind of slow the process a bit and allow some of the new forces to organize so that the first elections are not too soon.
What's the relative strength among those traditional forces that you just named? And what would be a better time to hold an election that wouldn't be too soon?
Well, I think the first problem is that they rushed the referendum on the amendments, and one of the amendments provides that a committee of 100 will write the articles of a permanent constitution. And the trouble there is it's almost certain that the better organized, the Muslim Brotherhood and the National Democratic Party, will wind up dominating the Committee of 100. So the process is in a way off the track right from the start, because the next step is going to be off the way. I mean, I'm not an election expert. It is the case that when we were discussing when to hold the first elections in Iraq, all of the experts on elections said it's too soon to have them in January of 2005, and indeed the elections in January 2005 in Iraq were dominated by the best organized, who were the Islamists.
Egypt. Do you think we will have a problem with an election coming up too soon, or is it something that we can possibly get past?
I can't see how they can do an election in June. I mean, they can have an election, but I'm concerned about where it comes out. And I would hope that we continue to have quite a lot of influence in Egypt, which needs to be exercised quietly and behind the scenes, particularly with the military. But I would hope that we would be able to taking a bit of time. And I'm sure the experts from the UN on elections and other NGOs who specialize in this would give the same advice. And I would hope that will happen.
Mm-hmm. As you look to the future, are you in general optimistic about some of the changes that are taking place in a region that has not changed politically in most ways for so long? Is this something encouraging depending on what develops in each country, I guess?
I think in the long run, defined as 15 to 20 years from now, this is a positive thing. But I think in the short and medium term, we are likely to wind up with governments in the region which are less well disposed towards the United States and towards our interests in the region, which means it's going to be, in the short run, more of a negative than a positive. In the long run, our interests are served by having representative governments in those countries, even if they're not as friendly to the United States.
And in Iraq specifically, short, medium, and long term, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think the Iraqis have hopefully got past the short term. They've had now 5 elections in the last 7 years. They obviously still have a lot of problems. They have not addressed the corruption problem, which is serious. There have been some backsliding on politics. They live in a rough neighborhood. Again, I think there's no question in the long run a democratic Iraq is in our interest, and it will provide a useful foil to an undemocratic Iran. So I think we have a major interest in being sure that Iraq continues on that path. I think they will.
And do you see any prospect for some of the changes taking place in the Middle East and North Africa to affect other parts of the world? I know we've heard some echoes or seemingly echoes in other places. Is this something that could become global?
Well, I suppose you could see some knock-on effects. You know, the place people talk about is China. China is very different. I mean, the culture is very different, and there is. You do have to look at each of these places. Libya is different from Egypt because its history is different, its tribal structure is different from Egypt, and you take to China, you've got a different culture, a different history. It's a little hard to say. You could see some of this spreading perhaps into sub-Saharan Africa, where you have governments that are not well run on the whole. It's a little harder. If the social media is as important as it appears to be, then language and culture become an important part. They become actually barriers to this kind of Twittering and Facebooking back and forth. I think it's less likely. It's not impossible, but less likely.
And the U.S. role in all of this, there's always that question, should the U.S. lead or should it be part of a coalition? Should it take a back seat in certain issues, deferring to regional powers and so forth? Where are you on this issue?
Depends on what we're talking about. If you're talking about the broad political developments, we ought to be leading it and be very visible in our statements in support of representative government. It's what we stand for. It's what we've stood for more than 200 years. If it's the more narrow question of the military operations in Libya, it's a more complicated situation, because I think the administration, in a way, was right to hope and wait for the Arab League to endorse what we're doing, because it gives a bit of cover to the operation. So there was a place to be a little bit more withholding of our leadership style. On the other hand, we're the guys with the military assets that will either make or break the operation in Libya, and let's hope we don't have to step out and become dramatically more obvious in our leadership, but in the end, we have to succeed.
And more generally speaking, what do you see the U.S. role in the world being in the 21st century? Do we continue to be in many ways the sole superpower? We've been called the indispensable nation, right. the key force in all of this. What do you think our role should be?
I think we do. I think whether we like it or not, we are in the position of being the world power. We're very much in the position the British Empire played in the 19th century. And if you think about it, there's really nobody out there who can replace us. You can't talk about the international community leading the international community. It's a meaningless phrase. It's going to be a nation, and the only one on the horizon is China. And I find it hard to believe that a world where China is the most important power, that world will better serve American or other interests. I don't think it would. So yeah, by default, it's going to be us.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador Bremer,
Nice
for
to be with
joining
you.
us today. And thank you for the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bersia. We'll see you next time.
This program was made possible by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office.